history of American football is deeply rooted in a tradition that combines elements of rugby and soccer, evolving over the decades into one of the nation's most beloved sports. To understand its origins, one must look back to a cold afternoon on November 6, 1869. On that day, the first intercollegiate football game was played between two New Jersey schools, Rutgers College, now Rutgers University, and the College of New Jersey, which later became Princeton University. This game, while quite different from the modern version of football, laid the foundation for the sport that millions of Americans follow religiously today. In the mid-19th century, American colleges were keen on promoting physical fitness and sportsmanship. However, there was no consensus on which sport would be the centerpiece of athletic competition. Soccer was a popular game in Europe and had been introduced to various American colleges, while rugby, another British export, was also gaining traction. Both of these sports influenced what would eventually become American football, but in 1869, the game played at Rutgers bore more resemblance to soccer than to today's football. Rutgers and Princeton had long shared a rivalry, and the idea of settling their differences on the athletic field was appealing to both schools. The two institutions agreed to a series of games, with each game taking place at their respective home fields. The first game was held at Rutgers, and the rules for that game were largely based on soccer. Each team consisted of 25 players, and the primary objective was to kick the ball into the opposing team's goal. The game played on that fateful November afternoon was markedly different from the sport we know today. For one, the teams were much larger. Whereas modern football teams field 11 players at a time, the Rutgers and Princeton squads each had 25 players on the field. The playing field was also larger than what modern players are accustomed to, 120 yards long. The goal of the game was to advance the ball toward the opponent's goal using any part of the body except the hands, a rule that is characteristic of soccer rather than modern football. There were no forward passes, no tackling, and no downs. The game resembled a chaotic blend of soccer and rugby, but it was played with an intensity and passion that prefigured the aggressive nature of American football. The ball itself was more spherical than the elongated football of today, further emphasizing the soccer-style gameplay. Points were awarded for each goal scored, with Rutgers and Princeton agreeing to play until one team reached 6 goals. This scoring system contrasts sharply with the point system of modern football, where touchdowns, field goals, and safeties accumulate points in smaller increments. The first game between Rutgers and Princeton took place on the grounds of Rutgers in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Approximately 100 spectators gathered to witness the historic event, though they likely had no idea they were watching what would become the first chapter in a storied American tradition. As the game began, it became clear that Rutgers had a slight edge in terms of strategy. The Rutgers players employed a unique tactic in which they would form a flying wedge, a V-shaped formation designed to protect the ball carrier as he advanced toward the goal. This innovation helped them dominate the early stages of the game, with Rutgers scoring the first goal. Princeton, however, was not to be outdone. They quickly adjusted their tactics and managed to score a goal of their own, tying the game. What followed was an intense back-and-forth struggle, with both teams displaying impressive athleticism and teamwork. By halftime, the game was tied at 4 goals apiece. In the second half, Rutgers' teamwork and strategic formations gave them the advantage. They managed to score 2 more goals, bringing their total to 6, which secured them the victory. The final score was 6-4 in favor of Rutgers, marking the end of the first college football game in history. Although Rutgers won the first game, Princeton was eager for a rematch, which they hosted a week later on their own campus. In the second game, the rules were slightly altered to favor Princeton's style of play, and the Tigers managed to win, splitting the series 1-1. Despite the split, these 2 games sparked a new enthusiasm for intercollegiate competition in the United States. Over the next few years, other colleges and universities began organizing their own football games, though the rules varied widely from one school to another. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and other institutions soon joined the fray, each contributing their own variations to the evolving sport. The 1869 games between Rutgers and Princeton are recognized as the first college football games, even though they did not resemble modern football in many respects. The contest was more akin to a soccer match, but it set the stage for future developments. Over the next decade, American football would slowly evolve, incorporating elements of rugby and soccer, and by the 1880s, it began to take on a form more recognizable to contemporary fans. In 1873, representatives from Yale, Princeton, Columbia, and Rutgers met to standardize the rules for intercollegiate football. This meeting led to the creation of a unified rulebook, though the game still closely resembled soccer. It wasn't until 1876, when Harvard invited McGill University from Montreal to play a series of games using rugby-style rules, that the sport began to shift toward the modern version of football. Harvard's players were intrigued by rugby's tackling and running aspects, and soon many American schools began adopting rugby-style rules. The turning point in the evolution of American football came with the contributions of Walter Camp, often referred to as the father of American football. In the 1880s, Camp, a player and coach at Yale, introduced several key innovations that helped differentiate football from rugby. He established the concept of downs, where a team had a set number of plays, initially 3, later 4, to advance the ball a certain distance. He also introduced the line of scrimmage and the 11-man team, key features of modern American football. Camp's innovations brought structure and strategy to the game, making it more organized and less chaotic than the rugby-like contests of the past. As more schools adopted Camp's rules, American football began to take on its current form. The first college football game in 1869 was a modest affair, attended by only a handful of spectators, but it was the beginning of something much larger. By the early 20th century, college football had become a major sport, with universities across the country fielding teams and competing in national championships. The intense rivalries, such as the annual Army-Navy game or the Harvard-Yale match, became defining events for students and alumni alike. Over time, college football grew into a massive cultural phenomenon, with packed stadiums, marching bands, and traditions that have become central to the American collegiate experience. Today, college football is a multi-billion-dollar industry, with games broadcast to millions of viewers and played in stadiums that seat tens of thousands of fans. The origins of this sport, however, can be traced back to that cold afternoon in November 1869, when Rutgers and Princeton faced off in a game that, while very different from the modern version of football, marked the dawn of a new American tradition. The first college football game in 1869 may not resemble the sport as we know it today, but its importance cannot be overstated. It was the first step in the evolution of American football, a sport that would go on to become a national pastime. Rutgers' victory over Princeton was more than just a win on the scoreboard. It was the birth of a cultural and athletic phenomenon that continues to shape American life more than 150 years later. The innovations and changes that followed transformed the game into what we recognize as football today. But it all began with two rival schools, a round ball and a shared love for competition.